How's it going, guys, and welcome to part 6 of my Ultimate Amara guide. In this part, we will be taking a look at all of Amara's legendary class mods and a couple purples, and running down the details of each of them and which ones are good, which ones are bad, and which are somewhere in between. If you'd like to stick to a specific one, however, feel free to use the chapters in the timeline of the video or down in the description. As well as that in the description, if you would like to see the class mods in action, I will also leave links to builds that I've done with the various class mods. But with that out of the way, let's get on into them. So before getting into the actual specific class mods themselves, every purple rarity and up class mod is able to roll with a set of 3 passives. These passives are randomly chosen from this list, alongside a set of manufacturer-specific bonuses. However, not every manufacturer is able to roll every single passive, but the potential ones are weapon damage, crit damage, accuracy, fire rate, reload speed, and projectile speed. Now, out of all these passives, it's very difficult for me to recommend a specific set as the best for Amara, as that entirely depends on the specific build that you're going for. Amara has an incredibly vast array of potential damage types available to her, so the rolls that you want can change drastically from build to build. With that being said though, very generally speaking, I think this is the list of passives that are best suited for a majority of Amara builds. Action Still cooldown rate is just a very important stat for Amara, as a lot of her builds rely on activating her Action Still as often as possible. Action Still damage scales tons of different things for Amara. It is a stat that she has access to herself, but more of it can really never hurt her because she gets more value out of it than probably any other character. Mag size, just a very good stat. Reloading less is more damage uptime. Melee damage, of course, as Amara is very good at melee. Fire rate is very good, as this is one of the few sources of fire rate that Amara actually has access to. And then of course just our general damage types: splash damage, crit damage, weapon damage, and weapon type damage. With weapon type, of course, meaning the rolls that are like pistol damage, heavy weapon damage, etc. Weapon type damage is different from weapon damage, as weapon type damage is V2, which makes it, of course, far better than the generic weapon damage for builds that already have a lot of weapon damage. So starting us off here is the Nimbus. Whenever Amara first damages an enemy with her Action Still, she creates a damaging cloud of her Action Still element at that location. Only one of these clouds is able to be active at a time. The Nimbus can roll with Tempest, Tonflux, and Violent Tapestry. So along with this cloud dealing constant ticking damage of your Action Still element, it can apply an additional status effect of that same element. The chance of the status effect to apply and the actual damage of it is pulled from your currently held weapon. So if you want to get the most damage possible, you should hold a weapon that has a very high status chance and damage. This applied status can also spread through wildfire. The easiest way to look at the Nimbus is as 2 separate damage sources, with the Nimbus itself as the primary damage, which isn't anything too special, and the secondary being the status applied by the primary damage, which is what pulls from the numbers of your equipped weapon. This damage is really what's more important here. That being said though, the primary damage is what scales off of your Splash, Still, Elemental V1 and V2 damage, and also gets 31 times Mayhem scaling. It's still nothing too amazing though. The ability for this class mod to roll Tempest is pretty damn good, as that can provide up to 60% elemental damage just from that skill. But unfortunately, it's the only legendary class mod that's able to roll Tempest, and as a whole, the Nimbus isn't really that great of a class mod. It is pretty fun to play around with, and there is definitely ways of optimizing it, but I've never really gotten it to do anything super meaningful. If you want to have some fun messing around for an hour or two, the Nimbus is a great choice, but for an actual viable class mod, not so much. Next, we have the Elementalist, which whenever Amara uses a Phased Grasp Action Still, her Action Still element is applied to all nearby enemies as a status effect. This is bug when your selected element is Cryo, and it just doesn't do anything. The Elementalist can roll Infusion, Wildfire, and Violent Tapestry. And overall, the Elementalist is pretty worthless since dot effects aren't really great during the endgame of BL3. The most that can be said about the Elementalist is that it's an instant application of some Harmageddon, but it's not like that's something that Amara really struggles with. It's kind of interesting that it rolls Infusion, which allows you to convert 80% of your gun's damage to your attuned element, but this isn't really worth anything, it's just kind of funny. And now onto the Dragon, which whenever Amara kills an enemy with a melee attack, her Action Still augment is triggered. The Dragon can roll with Do Harm, Restless, and Remnant. Now the augments that work with this are Revelation, Glamour, Stillness of Mind, Allure, and Expedite. Expedite is a little bit weird, as it's only the first instance of melee damage that gets a kill that rewards an Expedite stack. So if you hit an enemy with a Fish Slap, anything killed by that initial explosion will give you Expedite stacks, but anything by subsequent explosions with that same grenade will not. There's also a bit of a bug with the Dragon, where when you change your Action Still augment, the class mod will still activate the last augment until you reactivate your Action Still. But overall, the Dragon can roll Restless, which is kind of cool and pretty nice to have, but it's about the best I can say about this mod. This is a class mod that's obviously meant for for melee, but it doesn't really offer up much for melee. Like, I suppose there's some synergy between Revelation or Expedite, but you're losing out on just using something like the Muse or the Breaker, which provide far more for melee. And speaking of which, let's move on to the Muse. Whenever Amara damages an enemy with a melee attack, she projects melee damage outwards as an energy orb of her attuned element towards another nearby enemy. This has a 3-second cooldown, and this orb's damage is based off of 100% of the damage dealt in your melee hit. The Muse can roll with Laid Bare, Illuminated Fist, and Jab Cross. The Muse is definitely just the best in slot class mod for melee. These Muse orbs pretty much just make a single melee hit multi-target, which is incredibly important for melee, as for the most part, those sorts of builds are usually mostly single target. Along with that though, the skills that this can roll are just very strong. Illuminated Fist obviously is just incredible for melee damage, giving you another 75% damage from that skill for a total of 150%, but on top of that, it can also roll Laid Bare, which when activated increases the damage that enemies take by up to 50% with 6 out of 3. This is almost an entirely multiplicative damage bonus and is incredibly strong to have active. But that's not all, because previously with the Muse it was bugged and you were able to get an additional 3 points into Illuminated Fist, which would give you 225% melee damage from a single skill. This was incredibly busted, but the class mods that dropped during this time will still have these points on them. And while now under-leveled, these are still incredibly good if you can get a hold of some of them. Now, talking a little bit more about the Muse Orb itself, it's pretty much impossible to scale in damage once it's spawned. As I said, it scales from the damage you deal on the melee hit that spawns it, and it deals 100% of that damage. But, presumably to avoid double dipping, it's projectile damage, which is a pretty rare damage type in BL3, and there's pretty much no way to boost that type of damage. Now, while I do believe the Muse is the best, there is a very close runner-up, and that is the Breaker, simply providing damage reduction based on how close you are to the enemy, with the closer the better. This damage reduction is up to 29%. The Breaker is able to roll Personal Space, Find Your Center, and Jab Cross, and this is more so where the Breaker shines. As while the special effect of it is nice, it's not that great, especially when compared to the fact that it can roll Find Your Center, which will just straight up provide you an extra 100% melee damage from that skill for a total of 200%, which does actually mean it provides more raw melee damage than the Muse does if you ignore Laid Bare and +3 Illuminated Fist rolls. But it is definitely still a very good option for melee builds. However, it's also really strong for gun damage builds, especially using shotguns and close range weapons, as you can get +3 points into Personal Space, which will give you a max of 108% V2 damage when you're close to an enemy, which when built around can be pretty fucking crazy. And next we have the Kensei, which for 6 seconds after activating her action skill, Amara will gain bonus damage of her attuned element, scaling from 10% of her melee damage bonuses. So the way that this works is, let's say you have the 75% from Illuminated Fist and 100% from Breaker. You would have 1 plus 0.75 for Illuminated Fist, plus 1 for Breaker, and then multiply all that by 0.1, which gives us 0.275 or 27.5%, which you would then use as the percentage within the bonus elemental damage formula, which you can find either in the damage formulas document I've made for Amara or in the damage formulas video that I've made, both of which will be linked in the description. Kensei is able to roll with Unweave the Rainbow, Joyful Freedom, and No Mistakes in Nature. Now, while this scales off of melee damage, it isn't exactly dealing melee damage, but it also sort of is. The Kensei doesn't deal the usual melee damage. It is a very weird type of melee damage that doesn't really interact with most melee damage skills. So it won't proc Body and Mind or Ebb and Flow or Stone Relics or anything like that. In fact, it really doesn't interact as melee damage with anything at all, except for triggering the Shooting Star, and it will trigger it a lot. Enough for it to actually be a legitimate option for a build. However, even with that, where I believe the Kensei really shines is through the ability to roll another 3 points into Unweave the Rainbow for a total of 6, meaning that Unweave the Rainbow will scale from 66% of your damage dealt. This is also a completely viable build option and perhaps lets you hit for the highest numbers Amara possibly can, as Unweave the Rainbow is still damage and therefore gets Mayhem scaling along with any other damage boosts that apply to skill damage. If you want a better breakdown of how this works exactly, I would definitely recommend checking out part 5 of this series. There'll be a link up in the little corner somewhere and down in the description where I talk about UTR and some other skills. So if you want to see it in action, I do also have a video on Cold Snap Amara, which is my build utilizing the Kensei. Now on to perhaps Amara's most popular class mod, the Phasezerker. When Amara activates her action skill, she will gain her max rush stacks, which will begin decaying over time. Now the numbers on the card here are a little bit off, as Phasezerker actually provides 3% weapon damage and 3% action skill cooldown rate per rush stack. The Phasezerker also increases the cap of rush stacks by 5 for a total of 25, which at max means that you're getting 75% weapon damage and 75% action still cooldown rate. Awakening does not increase the bonuses gained by the Phasezerker. The Phasezerker is able to roll with Anima, Conflux, and Clarity. Now this is pretty much Amara's safest class mod. It provides 75% gun damage and cooldown rate while synergizing with other rush stack focused stills. And while I do believe that the Phasezerker is a good class mod, I think it's very often overused. Amara has a lot of sources of a lot of gun damage through her Phase Slam or cast gun damage anointments, the Death's Blessing, or especially the Driver. A lot of those options, when properly built around, will provide far stronger builds on average. So the Phasezerker should only really be used for builds where you don't have as much gun damage from these other sources. I think the best example for a build for the Phasezerker is the Classic Ties That Bind, Action Still, and Bonus Element spam. Most of the anointments that you want to use for that setup are bonus elements, and the only gun damage you really get is from a Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge and your stills. So the Phasezerker slots in very nicely, as it will provide you gun damage, which is very helpful for that sort of build as you are lacking in it, while also providing cooldown rate to keep those bonus elements up. But I do often see cases where people use the Phasezerker on builds that already have a lot of other gun damage from other sources. And in a situation like that, it is kind of a waste of a class mod slot, as in that case you're pretty much just getting cooldown rate and better rush stack uptime, which for most builds that would utilize just those things alone, there's better options for. But this should nicely lead into our next class mod, the Golden Rule. Whenever Amara receives damage, she gains increased action still cooldown rate for a few seconds. This effect will stack. It is important to note here that self-damage will also stack this buff. However, as always, the Infernal Wish being the goofy motherfucker it is, the dot applied from that will not stack this cooldown rate. The Golden Rule is able to roll with Mindfulness, Laid Bare, and Helping Hands. Now to contrast me finding the Phasezerker overrated, I think the Golden Rule is pretty damn underrated, and I personally have been running it and experimenting with it for quite some time now. Now with the passive, obviously this provides a lot of cooldown rate, which is a stat that Amara loves and is practically required for many builds. But along with that, and what I think makes this class mod strong, is that it can roll points into Laid Bare, which will provide a 50% damage bonus to anything damaged by your action stills when it has 6 out of 3 in it. This 50% may seem kinda small, but it's almost entirely multiplicative, being only additive with Harmageddon. So you can think of the Golden Rule as a Phasezerker for when you're running those higher gun damage builds, which this can let you use those Phasecast and Slam gun damage anointments incredibly effectively, which when doing so, I am able to get noticeably higher amounts of damage out of the Golden Rule than I can the Phasezerker with a somewhat similar setup, more optimized for the Phasezerker. The Zerker is a really good class mod for many builds, but keep in mind again, it provides gun damage. So again, it's better for builds that don't have a lot of gun damage, but if you are running a build that has more gun damage, the Golden Rule is almost always better to multiply that gun damage by 50%. One final thing to mention with the Golden Rule is that it's also able to roll points into Helping Hands, which can also be pretty nice. Damage reduction isn't often that great of a stat, and I will get into it more a little bit later, but when you have a high amount of damage reduction from a single source, it can actually be noticeable. So even having 3 of your points taken up by Laid Bare, getting those other 2 into Helping Hands, or that 7 out of 5, can actually make a pretty decent difference. Up next is the Spiritual Driver, and if you want gun damage, this is the best way to get it. Whenever Amara activates her action still, she applies her action still element to herself. Amara's gun damage is increased while moving. The quicker she moves, the greater the gun damage bonus. At base walking speed, this is 20% gun damage. At running speed, it is 45% gun damage, and this can hit up to around 500% gun damage. The driver is able to roll Helping Hands, Clarity, and Mindfulness, with Mindfulness of course synergizing very well with that self-damage, as the self-applied dot will stack it. Bonuses to status effect damage and duration will also apply to that self-applied status effect. Now the driver is just a fantastic base to work a build off of through other multipliers, which Amara has a lot of just within her trees, but also has even more access to through various other gear and anointments that she can make great use of. You can definitely just hit for some crazy high damage numbers with a proper setup here, and the standout here is definitely for splash damage builds, as getting 125% splash damage from your anointments with 500% gun damage is just gonna wipe anything. The biggest downside to the driver is that it lacks cooldown rate. However, with a proper build, cooldown rate doesn't really matter if you're gonna kill anything quick enough anyways. Next is the Death's Blessing, which on kill from a Remnant Orb, a Blessed Orb will spawn, which increases Amara's weapon damage by 150% for 20 seconds. The Death's Blessing can roll with Remnant, Wrath, and Atman. Now, the Death's Blessing can be pretty good, but but often I find it's too inconsistent for my liking. 150% weapon damage, however, can slot into many builds incredibly nicely, and on top of that, this class mod can roll with Wrath, and can also get up to 4 points in it for a total of 7, which provides another 46.67 to 93.34% weapon damage, which means that the Death Blessing in total can provide 243.34% weapon damage. Now, the Death's Blessing has a pretty similar use to the Driver, just being a lot of gun damage to slap other multipliers on, but just feeling a bit more like a standard playstyle instead of having to constantly be moving as fast as you can. Personally though, I just find the Driver to still feel a lot better to use, as you can more actively upkeep the damage rather than relying on the Death's Blessing to proc properly. Overall though, it is definitely still a solid option. And finally here for our legendary class mods, we have the Stone. Whenever Amara receives damage, she has a 10% chance to gain a stack of Rush. For every stack of Rush, Amara gains 3% damage reduction. This class mod also increases your max Rush by 5 for 25 stacks, which means that it can provide 75% damage reduction at max. Important to note that damage over time effects will not generate Rush stacks. The Stone is able to roll with Do Harm, Violent Tapestry, and Awakening. Honestly, I think the Stone is a fucking sleeper here. First thing to talk about is that damage reduction. Now, damage reduction is a difficult stat because most of the time it's just not good. The problem with it is two things. First off, most incoming damage during the endgame is scaled so high while your health pool stops scaling at level 72 that most damage reduction doesn't really matter. You can cut 1,000,000 in half, but it's still 500,000, and that's probably about 450,000 damage too much. That's a bit of an exaggeration for most situations, but you get the point. The second problem is the way that damage reduction stacks. I'll put a link in the description where you can read more on the specifics of that, but in short, it stacks like shit. Having even just 2 sources of damage reduction is pretty much a waste, so most of the time you only want one. But still, for that one source to do anything, it's gotta be high, like, I don't know, 75% maybe. Wait a minute. So yeah, the Stone is a single source of 75% damage reduction. There are still enemies that will health gate you, but the list is drastically reduced with the Stone. The biggest thing to note though is definitely damage over time effects. Most of those will just fucking tickle. Go ahead. Hug that barrel. This isn't it for the Stone though, as it can roll with Do Harm and Awakening. At 10 out of 5, Do Harm can provide up to 9% skill damage per stack, or at 6 out of 3, Awakening can boost all your Rush skills by 60%, which 60% from Awakening pretty much makes all Rush skills act as though they have 8 out of 5 in them. But with 5 out of 5 and 6 out of 3 in Awakening, you will get 7.2% skill damage from Do Harm, 3.2 to 8.4% reload speed from Alacrity, 4.8% status chance from Violent Tapestry, and probably the coolest thing here is that the Stone has a self-synergy with Awakening, as the damage reduction from it per stack is boosted to 4.8%, which means at 25 stacks, you're getting 120% damage reduction from a single fucking source. What? Yeah, at that point, good luck taking damage. I'd like to see you fucking try, bozo. Now, I personally don't have too much experience with the Stone, but it's got a hell of a lot of potential within it, and I think it's one of the few examples in BL3 of a more utility-focused class mod actually done right. It provides you so many various things, from generating rush stacks to boosting the effectiveness of those rush stacks, and then also just giving you an insane amount of damage reduction, in a manner that makes what is usually one of the worst stats in the game actually usable. Now, before I finish off here, I do have a couple honorable mentions of purple class mods. The first being the Brawler, which can roll with Samsara, Arms Deal, and Personal Space, all three of which are of course very good skills. However, Samsara doesn't roll on any other class mod, and Arms Deal only rolls on one other purple one. But with 6 out of 3 in Samsara, you can get up to 10% per stack and % missing health regen, which means up to a 50% bonus of each at max stacks. And with 10 out of 5 in Arms Deal, that's 40% splash damage. We then have the Acsetic, which can roll with Atman, Burn Both Ends, and Body and Mind. The big ones here being Body and Mind, because with another 3 points, you're pretty much doubling the base damage of Body and Mind, so you could really focus in on that damage and scale it even higher than you otherwise could. And Burn Both Ends, which at 10 out of 5 will be providing you 10% damage per stack. Now, Burn Both Ends is a bit of a weird damage type, but it is elemental damage. It just applies even when you're not dealing elemental damage. So it always slots in, being additive with other elemental damage bonuses. However, it will be active no matter what, which means on non-elemental damage, it is actually fully multiplicative, as there wouldn't be any other elemental damage bonuses being applied. So at 10% of that per stack and a max of 15 stacks, that means you can get 150% conditionally multiplied multiplicative damage or at least elemental damage, which definitely sounds like it has some potential. And finally here for our honorable mentions, we have the Mantis, which can roll with Transcend, Steady Hands, and Fast Hands. Though the important one here is Transcend, which at 6 out of 3 will provide 54% crit damage per stack with 120% accuracy, which you can get 2 stacks of easily through Avatar, or 108% crit damage and 240% accuracy. The Mantis can legitimately just be a very good class mod, especially for bossing, and is one of the very few purple class mods in BO3 that I think can actually be the core of a build. But that's gonna about do it for this one. As always, if you guys have any more questions about class mods or just Amara in general, feel free of course to leave them in the comments down below, and I will answer to the best of my ability. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, I would definitely appreciate a like and a subscribe and all that. Down in the description will be a link to my Twitch channel where you can follow, be notified of when I go live, and just below that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.